1 week. That's how much time it's been since President Donald Trump and North Korea's Kim Jung Un met and agreed to a lasting and stable peace. But there are lots of questions about this historic summit. Among them, are there things to watch and listen for in the coming weeks and months? And what do we have clarity on? I put those questions and more to UMass professor and North Korea expert Paul Musgrave.
Well, this summit is going to go down, I think, as the moment when North Korea's nuclear program was almost normalized, where the world, and especially the United States, accepted that the North Koreans, for now at least, have nuclear weapons and will be treated as a significant power in Northeast Asia.
Which is a big change from where we were a week prior to this, right?
A big change from where we were a week prior to this, a big change from last year with the fire and fury tweets, and certainly a big change over the last several decades of the United States treating North Korea as a rogue nation or part of the axis of evil.
Yeah. I want us to look at the four sort of primary pieces of this agreement. And the first is that the United States and North Korea commit to establish new relations in accordance with the desire of the peoples of the two countries for peace and prosperity. And I wanted to read the exact wording because to me that's very specific language. What do you think is beneath that language? What's the purpose of it?
I think one of the things that's beneath that language is to express kind of what in the Cold War we would have called the spirit of Singapore, this idea of the two countries, the two leaders meeting and, as bizarre as it may seem, meeting in a spirit of peace. I mean, that was really the most important symbolic importance of this agreement, and to have it expressed there, that's really part of the communique that I think that people will point to for a long time.
So second tenet here, United States and North Korea will join their efforts to build a lasting and stable regime on the Korean peninsula. So is that then working South Korea into this as well?
I think that is how you have to understand that. And it's interesting that South Korea isn't mentioned in that point. Neither is China. So we have a lot of groups that are being left out. It's hard to say sometimes whether this was intentional or whether the preparation for the summit was so slapdash, but I think that it is significant that it does recognize that Washington and Pyongyang will work toward some sort of a new settlement of the Korean peninsula.
This next piece, which includes the word denuclearization, which we've talked about with you in the past, is included in this. So it says that North Korea commits to work toward complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Now, we talked about this in the past, but I want us to go over it again. How is North Korea defining that word denuclearization?
So denuclearization is a big term of art. The U.S. and North Korea interpret it differently. For North Korea, it's always been about removing all countries' nuclear weapons from the Korean peninsula, including those of the United States. For the United States, of course, it's about removing North Koreans' nuclear weapons. And the phrase that we don't have in this point, and which is something that the United States has long insisted upon, was complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. And the fact that verifiable and irreversible are not in there is really almost a diplomatic defeat for the United States in terms of giving up what U.S. policy has aimed for a long time.
So how do we test that theory then? How do we know what is actually meant by that language, or when will we know?
Well, one of the great arts of diplomacy is coming up with formulas that everybody can live with and that everybody can put their own stamp on. Here, the United States did want a specific sort of meanings to come out. President Trump never quite signed on to that. He was always more interested in having a summit and having a way to move forward and, in fact, to de-escalate the crisis that we lived through in 2017. For the North Koreas, the fact that they're committed to a process with no timetable, no intermediate steps, no inspection regime, that's really something that says that right now their nuclear deterrent, which they've declared to be complete, is going to be around for at least the foreseeable future.
Fourth point in the agreement that was reached last week, the United States and North Korea commit to recovering the POW remains, including in the immediate repatriation of those bodies that have already been identified. Is this the type of detail that you would have expected in this kind of an agreement?
On the one hand, it's a little bit surprising to see a point about POW MIAs in an agreement of this sort with a war that ended more than 6 decades ago. On the other hand, this is exactly the kind of tangible takeaway that summits routinely produce, something that both sides can point to as something that will lead to a process that people can say. It's also something that sets up increasing political opportunities or increasing opportunities for the president to take credit when additional remains, if additional remains are found. And this is something that's incredibly important to the families of the people, of the victims of the war, but it's also something that in the shadow of the great nuclear discussions that we're having kind of seems a little bit pale as the only tangible policy outcome of this agreement.
What are some other tangible things that might have been included that weren't?
Well, one of the big ones that people were talking about was an actual treaty or steps to an actual treaty to end the Korean War. Even though the armistice was signed in 1953 and it's mostly held for the last 65 years, there still hasn't been an actual end to the war. Having an actual peace treaty that would formally end that war was something that people talked about.
And we did see North and South Korea come together
North
in
and
April.
South Korea, they've had their summits. There have been a number of summits between Chairman Kim and President Xi Jinping.
And it's even referenced in the document.
Exactly. And so there was definitely some sort of diplomatic momentum behind something bigger. As an intermediate step, there could have been an agreement to renegotiate the armistice agreement in order to give the United States a chance to extend to North Korea the security guarantees that it has long wanted against a possible U.S. restart of the Korean War. We didn't see those sorts of things. So even though people beforehand were talking about this as a possible Nobel Peace Prize moment for President Trump, what we got here was far, far short of that goal.
In terms of what this agreement means for our relations, United States relations with South Korea, the fact that the exercises that the United States and South Korea had partnered on for years are now going to be stopped, and the fact that that wasn't made known to them except through the media, what do you think that's going to do between U.S.-South Korea relations?
You've got this exactly right. On the one hand, President Moon has got essentially a diplomatic green light to continue on his path of opening up to the North and continuing the dialogue that they began with their historic summit a couple of months ago. On the other hand, the process by which this summit was conducted and the process by which that important announcement about the cessation of U.S.-South Korean joint exercises was made, deeply disturbing to the South Korean government. When President Trump announced that the summit was canceled, before it was uncanceled, the South Koreans also found out about that the same way the rest of us did, through President Trump's Twitter feed and through the media. So you have two really significant points at which the United States has cut South Korea out of an issue that, as important as this is to the United States, is absolutely existential to South Korea.
We have about 30 seconds left, and I want to ask you quickly, what should we be looking for and listening for in the weeks and months ahead now?
Right now, I think we should be looking at the relationship between the South and the North. You should also be keeping an eye on how Japan responds to this over the long term. If the United States starts to weaken its commitment to South Korea, it might also do so for Japan, and that could lead to a much more testy situation in East Asia.
Professor Paul Musgrave, thanks so much.
Thank you.